Stop thinking they're the ones holding you back. They're not. What holds you back isn't in anyone's hands. It's in the hardest place to look, inside you. Carl Jung once said that as long as the unconscious remains unconscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it destiny. And do you know what the cruelest part is? You'll continue to believe you're choosing while repeating contracts you never signed, defending masks you didn't ask for, and carrying guilt that isn't yours. There's no cheap self-help talk here. I'm not going to tell you to think positively or believe in yourself, because that only works until the next trigger knocks you down. What I'm going to show you is how to disarm, one by one, the invisible mechanisms that give power to those who don't deserve to have any over you. And when you realize it, you'll discover that you don't need them to change to free yourself, because the key has always been in your hand. But there's one detail no one tells you. The moment you break free, the game changes. And that's when many people run back to prison, thinking it was home. You'll understand why this happens and how to ensure it never happens to you again. The invisible prison, how the unconscious sustains control. The most dangerous prison has no walls, no bars, no armed guards. It lives inside the mind. It's built brick by brick with experiences, fears, and beliefs you don't even know you carry. Carl Jung said that as long as the unconscious remains unconscious, it will control your life, and you call it destiny. It's like driving a car on autopilot, thinking you're choosing your path, when in fact, an invisible route has been programmed for years. This prison is subtle. It disguises itself as, I'm just like this. It's always been this way in my family. I have no choice. No, but the truth is, most of your decisions aren't yours. They're reflections of patterns stored in the basement of your psyche. And when the ego gets used to this confinement, it doesn't even question it. It defends the cell as if it were home. True spirituality begins when you dare to look at these invisible chains. And ironically, the first step to breaking them is not fighting them, but seeing where they're attached. Imagine someone who always sabotages themselves in relationships, but swears they're unlucky in love. Or that person who constantly turns down professional opportunities, saying it's not the right time. This is no coincidence. It's the unconscious holding the reins. The persona, that social mask created for survival, filters everything that reaches you, maintaining what's familiar and blocking out what threatens your internal narrative. In shadow work, this is one of the most revealing points. Realizing that it's often not the world that's holding you back, but the mental script written without your permission. It's like being in a game where you think you're the main player, but in fact, you're following the orders of a hidden programmer. And this programmer is formed by traumas, inherited beliefs, and repressed memories. The curious thing is that the more you ignore it, the stronger the control becomes. Because the unconscious loves to operate in the dark, and the light bothers it. The question is, how do we begin to dismantle this prison? A simple but profoundly transformative practice is to record repetitive patterns. Choose a notebook just for this. Every time you feel yourself reacting automatically, whether with anger, fear, or even a strange coincidence, write it down. By the end of a week, you'll begin to realize that these aren't isolated events, but pieces of the same puzzle. This is bringing awareness to what was hidden, and when you see it, the ego can no longer pretend not to know. Jung used to say that awareness is like lighting a candle in a dark room. The light doesn't destroy what's there, it reveals it. And revelation is always the beginning of liberation. Because once you identify the cell, the next step is to realize where the key came from. And perhaps, without realizing it, you're already holding it. The unsigned contract, invisible loyalties. There are contracts that were never written, but that you signed with your heart, and often without even knowing it. These are invisible loyalties. They are born within the family, in the silences, in the looks that speak louder than words, in the stories repeated at the dinner table. Carl Jung knew that the family's collective unconscious shapes archetypes that repeat themselves generation after generation. Perhaps someone long ago lived in scarcity, and now you, even with opportunities, sabotage yourself so as not to betray that legacy. Or perhaps there was such great pain that the implicit rule became, no one here talks about it. The ego, to maintain acceptance, fulfills these secret contracts, and that's why you sometimes feel like you're living someone else's life. Spirituality, at this point, isn't an escape. It's the courage to break agreements that imprison. And breaking them can hurt, because guilt comes as a hidden clause. The most treacherous thing about these loyalties is that they're not explicitly imposed. You simply grow up understanding that this is how it's done, and that questioning it means being ungrateful. It's as if an invisible script is engraved in your psyche, guiding your choices without you even realizing it. In shadow work, it's common to see people discover they carry the pain of parents, grandparents, even uncles they never knew. A woman may constantly sabotage her career without realizing that deep down, she's afraid of surpassing her mother. A man may reject love out of unconscious loyalty to a father who was never happily married. The persona helps keep this drama going, a character who makes sense within the family narrative. But internally, the self begins to stir, urging you to break the cycle. Because blind loyalty isn't love, it's a handcuff in disguise. To begin identifying these contracts, a powerful exercise is to write down all the phrases you heard repeatedly in childhood. It could be, money doesn't bring happiness, men don't cry, a good woman doesn't do that, we've always been like this. Then ask yourself, who said that? In what context? Are these phrases universal truths or just inherited emotional clauses? Often, just by writing them down, you realize you're obeying a logic that isn't your own. And then the choice arises: continue signing the contract or tear it up. Jung said that freeing yourself from the family unconscious isn't about denying the root, but pruning the branches that stifle your growth. And this pruning will inevitably generate discomfort. Because when you begin to question these secret agreements, you'll discover that some of those who benefit from them will try to remind you that it's wrong to change. The shadow game, when the other dominates your ego. Not every shadow is yours. Often, the weight you carry belongs to someone else, but the ego, in its eagerness to be accepted, ends up assuming it as its own. Carl Jung called this projection, when the other dumps onto you what they don't want to acknowledge in themselves. And the curious thing is how silent this game can be. A criticism that has haunted you since childhood, a label that has stuck to your skin, an expectation that was never yours. And suddenly, you start living to sustain the image the other person has constructed. In spirituality, this is like handing over the helm and letting an unknown captain steer the ship. And the persona, trained to please, collaborates. It makes it seem like this path is yours, when in fact it's just an automatic response to maintain peace, a peace that is never true. Shadow play is subtle because it infiltrates intimate relationships, parents, partners, bosses, even close friends. Someone afraid of their own fragility might label you weak to maintain control. Someone afraid of being abandoned might convince you that you're incapable of making it on your own. In shadow work, realizing this is like lifting years of weight. An example, a woman who constantly tries to prove to her partner that she's faithful, when in fact the insecurity stems from him, not hers. Or a child who seeks eternal approval from their father, carrying criticism that never belonged to them. When the other dominates your ego, your identity becomes a distorted mirror. You see yourself, but don't recognize yourself. And meanwhile, The self remains trapped behind the curtain, waiting for its time to return to the stage. To escape this game, it's essential to create a psychic filter, something that allows you to separate what's truly yours from what's been projected onto you. One practical technique is to keep a diary of interactions. Every time you feel diminished or question your worth after a conversation, record exactly what was said and who said it. Then ask yourself, does this statement reflect something I truly feel about myself, or is it just that person's perspective? This trains the ego not to automatically accept everything handed to it. Jung reminded us that the unconscious loves to operate with borrowed material, and that part of individuation is giving back to the other what was never yours. And giving back doesn't mean conflict. It means saying internally and silently, "This doesn't belong to me." And from there, prepare the ground for the next step, uncovering the mask they've created for you. The mask they created for you. From an early age, someone handed you a mask and said, "This is how you're supposed to be." It wasn't a clear conversation, but a set of gestures, looks, and expectations. Carl Jung explained that the persona is necessary to live in society, but when it's constructed solely based on what others expect, it ceases to be a protection and becomes a prison. Maybe you were the funny one in the family, even on the days you wanted to cry, or the responsible one in the group, even when you were exhausted. These masks work so well that after years, you begin to believe that's who you are. And when someone tries to know your true face, the ego, frightened, retreats, because deep down there's a fear that without the mask, you won't be loved. Spirituality at this point is like a mirror that doesn't lie. It gives back the naked face, and that can be uncomfortable. The problem with these masks is that they're molded to please, and pleasing becomes an addiction. A child who realizes they only receive attention when they get good grades may grow up believing their worth lies in their performance. A teenager who only receives praise when they're strong learns to hide any sign of fragility. In shadow work, this realization is painful because it means admitting that much of your life was lived to maintain an image. And the cruelest part is that often this image isn't even admired by those who demanded it. It's like an actor who rehearses for years for a role, but the audience has already left. The persona, when shaped by the gaze of others, prevents the self from breathing. And when it begins to suffocate, symptoms emerge. Anxiety, chronic fatigue, a feeling of emptiness. Symptoms that don't disappear until you risk showing your true face. A simple exercise to begin identifying the mask is to ask people from different circles, family, friends, co-workers, how they describe you. Write it all down. Then compare it with how you feel you really are. This discrepancy reveals where the mask has stuck. Another practice is to observe moments when you feel relief in being alone. What do you stop doing or saying? This more relaxed version is a glimpse of your true face. Jung said that individuation is when the mask doesn't command, but serves, when you can wear it by choice, not by obligation. And it is at this point that a dilemma arises. When you remove the mask, you may encounter something even deeper: guilt. A guilt that is often the heaviest shackle anyone can carry. When guilt is the heaviest handcuff, guilt is like a polished handcuff. It shines from afar, even seems like an ornament, but inside it corrodes. Carl Jung understood that many feelings of guilt are not the result of real mistakes, but of broken expectations. Expectations that weren't always yours. Spirituality shows that we often carry inherited guilt tied to family or cultural archetypes. You might feel guilty for saying no to a relative, for seeking a better life than your parents had, or for choosing a path that doesn't fit your community's script. The ego, trained to avoid rejection, accepts this guilt as a sign that it's doing the right thing. But the truth is, it acts like a leash. You can walk, but never get where you really want to go. And the most dangerous thing is that over time, this leash becomes one with your own skin. This guilt also feeds on the fear of being misunderstood. How many times have you over-explained yourself to avoid appearing selfish? How many opportunities have you missed to avoid offending someone? In shadow work, we realize that guilt is often just an echo of someone else's control, a psychological reminder that you can't stray too far. It's as if there's an internal watchdog ready to sound the alarm whenever you act authentically. A common example: the person who feels guilty about resting because they've learned that value lies in constant productivity. Or the person who feels bad about ending a relationship even though they know they were unhappy because they fear being seen as ungrateful. The ego, in this scenario, acts as an advocate for guilt, defending it with convincing but false arguments. To weaken this shackle, a practical step is to create a list divided into two columns: real guilt and inherited guilt. Nay, in the first, list situations in which you violated a value you hold. In the second, record moments in which you felt guilty for going against external expectations. This simple separation already reveals the weight that shouldn't be on your shoulders. Jung reminded us that individuation requires enduring the temporary disapproval of those still trapped in their own emotional contracts. And this is where spirituality comes in, understanding that inherited guilt is actually an invitation to freedom. But when you decide to free yourself, you will inevitably face a decisive moment, the moment of psychological rupture. And it won't be easy. The moment of cut, psychological separation. The moment of separation isn't when you simply physically distance yourself, but when you cut the invisible cord that keeps your mind trapped. Carl Jung knew that breaking with unconscious patterns is like pulling out an old root. It hurts, it bleeds, but it makes room for the new. This psychological separation doesn't happen all at once. First comes the realization. That moment when you recognize that something no longer serves you. Then comes the internal resistance, the ego trying to convince you to remain safe, even when that safety is suffocating. It's at this point that spirituality becomes a blade, not to wound, but to cut what impedes growth. And the cut isn't just about people, it's about beliefs, habits, and archetypes that have served their purpose and now only take up space. Separating yourself psychologically means refusing to live as an extension of someone else's story. It means looking at your persona and asking, is this useful, or is it just a fantasy to maintain bonds that are making me sick? In shadow work, this is one of the most challenging exercises, saying, this no longer belongs to me, and standing by that decision in the face of others' reactions. Imagine someone who has always been the family's mediator, smoothing over conflicts to maintain harmony. At the moment of separation, this person decides to no longer intervene, and suddenly everyone accuses them of selfishness. The ego suffers because it has always fed on this validation. But for the self, it is the beginning of liberation. It is when your energy stops being used to sustain failed systems and starts nourishing your own life. A practical exercise to prepare for this cut is to write a letter you will never send. In it, express everything you feel for that person, belief, or pattern that needs to be ended. Include anger, sadness, gratitude, all together, without censorship. Then, burn or destroy the letter. This symbolic act signals to the unconscious that the process has begun. Jung believed that simple rituals like these strengthen internal resolve, creating new connections between mind and body. But be prepared, after the cut, there will be silence. And it is in this silence that you need to ground yourself, because the next step is not about isolation, but about building something new. The inner axis that does not bend. Personal power, the axis that does not bend. Personal power is not about controlling others, but about not being controlled. Carl Jung saw this as the consolidation of the self, an internal axis that remains firm even when the world tries to push. This axis is not born of pride, but of self-knowledge. It is the result of facing one's own shadow, of tearing off masks and breaking invisible contracts. When the ego understands its place, serving the self, not ruling, you begin to live with an autonomy that cannot be bought or taken away. True spirituality does not promise an absence of challenges, but the ability to remain centered in the midst of them. And this centering is what prevents old patterns, manipulative people, or even external chaos from pulling you from your path. The unbending axis is built day by day in small, seemingly mundane decisions. It's saying no to what violates your limits, even if it seems easier to give in. It's choosing the truth, even when lying would save you arguments. It's investing time in what strengthens your mind and body, whether through reading, meditation, or practices that expand consciousness. In shadow work, this axis is the antidote to emotional relapses. An example, a person who, after years of giving in to fear of rejection, begins to speak their mind without justifying themselves. At first, the discomfort is great, but over time, the sense of dignity becomes non-negotiable. Jung knew that inner dignity is not demanded, it is built, and once built, it is defended. An effective practice to strengthen this power is to create a pivot mantra, something you repeat to yourself when external pressure tries to distort you. It can be simple, like, I know who I am and I don't need to prove it. Write this mantra in visible places, in your planner, on your phone, on the mirror. This repetition trains your ego not to panic when faced with threats to your worth. Jung emphasized that individuation requires consistency, small, daily reaffirmations that solidify your internal structure. And when this structure is firm, you realize something incredible. The world continues to test you, but it can no longer manipulate you. And then comes the end of this journey, the moment you cease to be a target, when you stop being a target. No longer being a target doesn't mean the arrows stop being fired, it means they no longer find a home. Carl Jung knew that when the ego stops seeking approval and the self takes the helm, the emotional vulnerability that fueled manipulators dissolves. People who previously knew exactly which buttons to push become frustrated because those buttons have been disabled. It's like changing the lock on a door and not giving anyone the key. Spirituality at this point doesn't make you untouchable, but it gives you the discernment to choose your battles and often not even engage in them. And this lack of reaction, paradoxically, is what most bothers those who previously fed off its energy. When you're no longer the target, you realize that the same provocations you used to face lose their effect. A passive-aggressive comment no longer lights the fire it once did. An attempt to guilt-trip you becomes just noise. In shadow work, this is a milestone. You no longer react from open wounds, but from an inner clarity. Your persona becomes flexible, used when necessary, hidden when not. This doesn't mean being cold or indifferent, but selective about what deserves your emotional investment. A clear example, that person who used to drive you crazy now only receives a brief smile and your absence. Not out of revenge, but because you've understood that attention is the most valuable currency there is. To sustain this state, it's helpful to cultivate what Jung called the observer stance. It's the ability to see the situation without being swallowed up by it. A simple practice is, when faced with any provocation, to take 3 deep breaths before responding or deciding not to respond. This brief pause allows the self to decide the action, not the wounded ego. Over time, this posture creates such a stable energy field that most attacks simply dissipate before they reach you. And then, the feeling of freedom is almost physical. There are no more strings pulling, no hooks holding you back. It's like walking through an open field, knowing that finally your life is no longer directed from the outside. But to get here, you had to go through each stage of this journey. And now it's time to open the introduction so others can begin theirs. Now you know, the power they held over you only existed because you, unwittingly, handed over the keys. And what we saw here wasn't theory. It was the map to break every chain, from the most obvious to those hidden in your most banal routines. The question is, will you use this map or will you keep it in a drawer? Think about it. How many times have you felt like you were about to change your life and suddenly fell back into the same old patterns? This isn't bad luck. It's the unconscious pulling you back to the familiar. And if you don't want that to happen again, you need to keep working, because this was just the first cut. In the next videos, we'll delve into the deeper layers, the ones that, when you see them, will make the whole world seem different. So here's the invitation. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I want you to treat this space like that show you can't miss for anything, the one you're ready to watch every time you schedule, because you know it will change something in you. And before you go, answer in the comments, which of these invisible prisons did you realize was controlling you? Your answer could be the beginning of your next liberation.